Hello, my name is Nicole, and I had the pleasure of reading Dr. Galit Atlas's most recent book entitled Emotional Inheritance: A Therapist, Her Patients, and the Legacy of Trauma. It was published January this year. I'll be discussing the author's background for who this book was written, then I'll give a quick summary before I dive into the main points of the book. Finally, I'll discuss the reliability and validity of the theory of emotional inheritance and give my final thoughts. Let's jump in. Along with her private practice in New York City, where she is a clinical supervisor, Dr. Atlas is also on faculty at three organizations in New York City. She is the author of three clinical books and several chapters, mostly focusing on gender and sexuality. She has also written articles for the New York Times and received several awards. This book is meant for anyone who has experienced intergenerational trauma, which is probably most people. This is historical trauma that has been clinically shown to affect up to two preceding generations. This trauma includes, but is not limited to, war, suicide, neglect, and sexual abuse. In the book, and with her client's permission, Dr. Atlas dives into 11 case studies and finds that many times one isn't even aware of the specific or exact trauma their parent or grandparent suffered. But regardless of this not knowing, behavioral and emotional issues stemming from these traumas do surface. This book dives deep into the legacy of intergenerational trauma. This trauma has been empirically shown to affect the current generation. Utilizing the defense mechanism of repression, these painful ghosts or secrets are often held in the unconscious as a way of protecting our families, our relationship with loved ones, and ourselves. However, by confronting these ghosts, we may begin the process of healing our splintered psyche and ultimately move forward to live life more fully. We may work toward healing ourselves, our families, and ultimately future generations. Before taking a deeper dive into the main points of emotional inheritance, it's important to talk about epigenetics, which, according to the CDC, is the study of how our behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way our genes work. They are different from genetic changes in that they don't change our DNA sequence, but they can change how our body reads a DNA sequence. Throughout her book, Dr. Atlas discusses many classical psychoanalysis techniques and strategies that are still relevant today, including, but not limited to, the unconscious, anxiety, ego defense mechanisms, dreams, the importance of early memories in painting a picture of how the clients view themselves, the importance of being comfortable with silence while in session, and the relationship between client and therapist. It's clear that Dr. Atlas cares for her clients, and a few times while describing sessions with them, she utilizes countertransference by noticing her own emotional response to their stories. As our textbook author Corey explains, not all countertransference is bad, as it may act as, quote, the strongest source of data for understanding the world of the client and for self-understanding on the therapist's part, end quote. And Atlas utilizes it in a healthy way to guide her to more deeply understand her clients. The main points that Atlas makes are that secrets and traumatic experiences that our grandparents and parents have gone through actually affect our lives as well. As she describes, they affect our mental and physical health, create gaps between what we want for ourselves and what we are able to have, and haunt us like ghosts. In order to move forward like detectives, we must piece together the unseen. Atlas explains that those experiences that were too painful for us to entirely grasp and process are the ones that are passed down to the next generation. Western society's discussion of mental health has changed over generations. In many groups and places, it is no longer stigmatized to discuss trauma, abuse, and mental health. But this wasn't the case for our grandparents and maybe even our parents. Much of the research and examination on historical trauma began with Holocaust survivors. Atlas discusses the, quote, radioactivity of trauma, a term coined by Professor Yolanda Gatbell and used to describe the monstrous and destructive effects caused by sociopolitical and horrifying violence. Like nuclear fallout, future generations are affected by this violence. In part one of the book, Atlas looks at the third generation of survivors. One client, Eve, has a husband and a 12-year-old daughter and comes to Atlas while having an affair. It's revealed that Eve's mother was emotionally unavailable ever since she'd lost her own mother, Eve's grandmother, at age 14. Eve's affair, specifically sex, serves as a way to actively bring herself into the heart of her family trauma. Eve and Dr. Atlas realized that Eve's affair was perpetuating the inherited trauma of the quote, dead mother by making her absent from her own child. Another client discovers that her grandmother suffered sexual abuse and that trauma was passed down through acts that were meant to protect her children and grandchildren, but actually caused shame, embarrassment, and pain. In part two, Atlas examines how one client, Noah, has a preoccupation with death and even imagines he had a twin who died. It's eventually revealed to him that this fantasy was actually true. He did have a twin brother who died at birth. How was it possible that Noah knew of his twin's death? Dr. Atlas believes it has to do with our ability for unconscious communication. Another client, John, was only a few months old when his older sister, Jane, died while riding a bicycle. Atlas discusses how unwelcome babies, which is what John was after his sister's death, are in a constant struggle to stay alive once they're adults. She also discusses the trauma of war and her patient Ben, who is in attempt to heal his father's trauma from the hardships of immigration, became a commando soldier, which created new trauma for him. In part three, Atlas discusses the current generation of secret holders. It is important for us to understand that we are now responsible for our emotional inheritance, and we are the only ones who may bring these secrets to the light so that we may heal them. One client, Guy, plays out his own experience of violence and distrust. He knows more about Dr. Atlas than she is comfortable with, and in protecting himself, he unintentionally created an environment of fear for Atlas. Another client, Alice, is about to have a baby, but she's struggling because of her fear that her family of creation will end up like her family of origin. When Alice was about 8, her mother found Alice's father had had another family. Dr. Atlas helps Alice more deeply examine how Alice's loyalty to her mother and her mother's pain, as well as her shunning of her father, has limited Alice from seeing the entire picture and experiencing life in the present. This examination has the potential to help Alice stop the cycle and disrupt the legacy of pain. Psychoanalysis has come a long way since its beginnings, and Dr. Atlas is an active member in the psychoanalysis community. Psychoanalysis continues to be supported by both case studies and experimental evidence. Is the theory of emotional inheritance reliable? Atlas has shown, using 11 case studies plus her own emotional inheritance, that there is a consistency to this work. Furthermore, the overall concept of epigenetics has been shown to be reliable in that it consistently reproduces similar results. Is the theory valid and measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? In order to answer this question confidently, I would need to read more peer-reviewed literature to give a definitive yes. However, the case studies in this book, along with Dr. Atlas's reputation and experience, have me leaning towards a yes. This theory is valid. I highly, highly recommend this book to anyone seeking more insight into themselves and into their family. Unfortunately, many people, most likely including our ancestors and ourselves, have experienced trauma. Particularly in past generations, trauma was not spoken about or handled in a way that led towards healing. As the current generation, we are now the ones responsible to uncover those secrets that have been hidden away, or of acknowledging our own experiences with trauma. In uncovering, acknowledging, and healing these inherited wounds, we stop them from haunting ourselves and future generations. Finally, although the book was broken up into 3 parts, each story was relevant to all 3 generations, which is another way of modeling how interconnected we are with our family history. Here are my references. Thank you so much for listening.